Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third of three lectures collectively titled Krasner in Context by the foremost experts on Krasner's life and work. In conjunction with the current exhibition, Lee Krasner, Portrait in Green, at the Pollock Krasner House and Study Center. I'm Helen Harrison, the museum's director, and I want to thank Victoria Pilato, Stony Brook University's digital librarian, for co-hosting the series, and Stony Brook's John H. Marburger III Fund and the Herman Goldman Foundation for supporting it. Today's speaker is Robert C. Hobbs, the Rhoda Thalheimer Endowed Chair of American Art Emeritus at Virginia Commonwealth University. He has published widely and has organized dozens of exhibitions, many of which have been shown at important institutions in the US and abroad. His research also includes in-depth studies of regional, self-taught, African-American and American Indian artists, as well as investigations of contemporary craft media. His special research areas span the 20th and 21st centuries, and his publications include monographs on Milton Avery, Alice Aycock, Edward Hopper, Robert Smithson, Kara Walker, and a forthcoming one on Peter Halley, as well as two books on Lee Krasner, a monograph published by Abbeville in 1993, and the publication that complemented Krasner's traveling retrospective exhibition, which was published by Abrams in 1999. His talk today draws on that expertise together with material from his 2020 book, Robert Motherwell, Abstraction and Philosophy. So I'm going to turn it over to Robert, and let me share the screen.
First, I would like to thank Helen Harrison for her many years of important service. She's made this institution, the Pollock Krasner House and Study Center, a national landmark, as well as a special place for scholars, and I am personally grateful for her help over the decades. We will no doubt hear a great deal more about Helen's activities after retirement, especially her continued contributions to mid-20th century art history. 3 years ago, Helen, are you doing slides? Okay, thank you. I'm so pleased you are, rather than myself. 3 years ago, Routledge published my book, Robert Motherwell, Abstraction and Philosophy. This study was the first to investigate Motherwell's close connections with the British expatriate process philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, whom he had known during his time as a Harvard University graduate student in philosophy during the years 1937 through 38. This study was a belated response to my first meeting with Motherwell in October 1974, the day he returned home after 5 heart operations. At the time, I was investigating his elegies to the Spanish Republic for my dissertation. Because of his grave situation, Motherwell focused on the one person he believed to have been crucial for his development as an abstract artist. Quote, "My work is profoundly indebted to Alfred North Whitehead. Perhaps he is too difficult for anyone to figure out the connections," end of quote. My initial response was to pursue this extraordinarily generous insight and challenge, but my already approved dissertation topic took me in a different direction. In my Routledge book, I emphasize the formative role of the collage aesthetic for Motherwell's work, including his paintings. This contrapuntal medium that depends on ongoing conversations between similar and disjunctive materials is particularly amenable to Whitehead's metaphysics. His philosophy replaces a human-centered universe with spontaneously self-generated alliances in which humans are called forth as part of an ongoing process that involves them in temporary and longer-term alliances. Establishing parity between artists and materials is the single most important generative concept for Motherwell's overriding collage aesthetic, and he regarded collage as modern art's single greatest contribution. Motherwell first began making collages in 1943 when the New York art dealer, Peggy Guggenheim, offered him the opportunity to participate in the first international exhibition of this medium to be held in the United States. This was not the first time American artists embraced collage. Author Dove deserves special place for the collages he made in the mid-1920s. In the late 1930s and early 40s, the elite Park Avenue Cubists, Albert Eugene Gallatin, George L.K. Morris, and Susie Freelandheisen were creating stirring synthetic Cubist collages and collage paintings. To prepare for Peggy Guggenheim's exhibition, Motherwell and Pollock decided to meet and make their separate works. It was a time of rare camaraderie between the two artists, and Motherwell recalled the intensity with which Pollock approached his collages, even though this medium proved to be incidental to his overall work. The two men first became acquainted because Chilean surrealist Roberto Ashurin Mata wanted to return to a truer and more authentic form of surrealism than his artistic colleagues were then practicing. And he selected to work with such Americans as Motherwell, Pollock, and William Basiotis, among others, in order to do so. I contend that Motherwell began at this time to rethink, in Whiteheadian terms, surrealism's generative principle, psychic automatism, a free associational technique outlined in 1924 by the self-appointed high priest of surrealism, André Breton. After meeting with Mata and participating in the several work sessions he organized, Basiotis, Motherwell, and Pollock socialized on occasion. One evening, they, together with their spouses and Lee Krasner, decided to play the surrealist game, The Exquisite Corpse, in which each person separately created a section of a folded collaborative drawing on the subject of rain that would reveal strange and alluring conjunctions once it was spread out. Their collaboration that evening is evidently no longer extant, so I'm showing a surrealist example. In the later 1940s and 50s, Krasner and Pollock resided near Motherwell on Long Island. The couple lived in the then working class community of the Springs, outside the considerably more upscale East Hampton, where Motherwell built an extraordinary modern home designed by the French expatriate architect Pierre Charot. Although Motherwell's home was based on the galvanized steel structures called Quonset huts, they were inexpensive buildings during World War II, but his house, with its carpenter detailing, was costly. Living in different worlds dictated in part by their incomes and backgrounds, Motherwell was the son of Wells Fargo CEO, while Krasner and Pollock were from modest backgrounds. The three artists never became close. In fact, as I intend to demonstrate, Krasner and Pollock informally vied for the title of Chief Abstract Expressionist. So while Pollock dripped paint, Mark Rothko brushed on dry pigment, Basiotis worked with jewel-like glazes, and Barnett Newman created his majestic zips. Motherwell and Krasner cut, ripped, and pasted their purchased, found, and discarded materials, in addition to establishing themselves as major first-generation abstract expressionist painters. Motherwell and Krasner were not the only abstract expressionist collages. De Kooning, on occasion, created collages, and the overlapping of forms endemic to this artistic genre, coupled with his energized brushwork, informed some of his works from the late 1940s and early 50s. Anne Ryan acknowledged the impact of seeing in 1949 work by the German Dadaist Kurt Schwitters, and her intimate collages, some only a few inches in size, often reveal the respect she accorded this early 20th century artist. In 1952, Conrad Maccarelli, working with collage when he was in Mexico and began working with collage when he was in Mexico and ran out of paint. The following year, he moved next door to Pollock and Krasner in the Springs and became close friends with them. This was the same year when Krasner began creating collages. However, instead of carrying on a conversation with Krasner's work, Marcarelli's collage paintings appear to be indebted to Pollock's infrequent forays into this medium. In 1956, it was Marcarelli who identified Pollock's body in the automotive incident that took his life, and that of his passenger, Edith Metzger, and he made this monumental collage painting in memory of the event, where an abstracted recumbent figure of Jackson Pollock appears. In 1946, Motherwell noted in Beyond the Aesthetic that collage, with its disparate elements, is a relational structure in which one is symbolic and literally readjusting actual fragments of the world. Quote, "The sensation of physically operating on the world is very strong in the medium of the papier collé, or collage, in which various kinds of paper are pasted to the canvas. One cuts and chooses and shifts and pastes, and sometimes tears off and begins again." End of quote. Whitehead's process philosophy enabled Motherwell to move beyond a romantic view of artists as the sole initiators of feelings in art. That is, the idea that art is imbued with an artist's emotional expression, which has mistakenly been regarded as an abstract expressionism truism. Instead, Motherwell's collages are predicated on Whitehead's understanding of creativity as a formation of spontaneously congregating elements in which artists are on a par with their materials, so that a piece of paper or a certain color, rather than the artist per se, catalyzes each new artwork. In addition, Whitehead views quantum theory as eminently creative, since it is based on ongoing velocities. In 1925, Whitehead explains that his process theory is predicated on self-selecting forces grouped together to achieve novel unity. In Science in the Modern World, he writes, quote, "One of the most helpful lines of explanation of quantum theory is to assume that an electron does not continuously traverse its path in space. The alternative notion as to its mode of existence is that it appears as a series of discrete positions in space, which it occupies for successive durations of time. It is as though an automobile, moving at the average rate of 30 miles an hour along a road, did not traverse the road continuously, but appeared successively at the successive milestones, remaining for 2 minutes at each milestone." End of quote. Quantum theory's emphasis on the unpredictable jumps or shifts of electrons enabled Whitehead to speculate about a spontaneously self-generated dynamism, that is, energy, as the ultimate state of the universe. Motherwell's early foundation in Whiteheadian theory enables us to view his art and also abstract expressionism, since he proselytized his ideas among his fellow New York School associates as participating in one of the 20th century's most revolutionary theories, quantum physics. Motherwell reconceives Whitehead and quantum physics congregating energies as the art object per se, and artist as one among a number of factors, so that they work in tandem with their chosen medium. His approach to collage, which involves respecting the relative autonomy of each component, is evident in one of his first pieces in this genre, Joy of Living. The title of this work comes from Henri Matisse's Le Bonheur de Vivre. Motherwell's collage, with its 2 centralized magenta pieces of paper, now a faded pink, resembles a teeming and jostling world suggested by Matisse's painting, even though the Motherwell is comprised of different types of imagery, including a military training map in the upper right, seemingly organic blobs, grids and frames, automatic gestures, and sets of web-like configurations. In creating this collage, Motherwell avails himself of a rich assembly of mixed media, including oil, wash, fabric, paper, crayon, charcoal, and ink on paperboard. Working together, these figurative references and this wealth of media enunciate an intensely competitive world, articulated through tensions occasioned by very different velocities and temporalities. The respect Motherwell pays to the distinct character of each constituent making up this and other collages supports Whitehead's idea of beauty. For Whitehead, beauty depends on permitting each element to maintain its original character, even as it participates in the formation of an overall composition. While the collaged elements in Joy of Living should ideally be able to be considered first as formal elements participating in an activated composition, before accruing the different meanings society has ascribed to them, Whitehead rightly considers such direct observation to be an impossibility, since cultural interpretations are intertwined with empirical looking and impact not only what is seen, but also how it is viewed. While some of Motherwell's early collages only slowly come into focus as distinct compositions, instead of riotous conglomerates of competing geometric shapes and organic forms, their differing forces suggest a series of continued transformations. This composition accords with Whitehead's aesthetic, namely, quote, when the parts contribute to the massive feeling of the whole, and the whole contributes to the intensity of feeling of the parts, end of quote, with the added proviso that the work be as fresh and spontaneous as an actual occasion, since, quote, spontaneity, originality of decision belongs to the essence of each actual occasion, end of quote, which Motherwell interpreted as the artwork per se. Motherwell found that Whitehead's ideas worked in tandem with his early fascination with French symbolist poetry, particularly the theories of Stéphane Mallarmé, which took place during a year-long undergraduate class at Stanford University. Insights into the expressiveness of Motherwell's collage materials, including his responsiveness to paper, are supported by his long-term fascination with Mallarmé's poetry and thought. This intrigue can be documented by Motherwell's many references to this poet, including his collage Mallarmé's Swan, originally called Mallarmé's Dream. The difference in the two titles is significant because the earlier one connects this poet with the expatriate surrealists with whom Motherwell was becoming acquainted in the early 1940s and their penchant for dream imagery. The second title, Mallarmé's Swan, affirms this poet's considerable role as a founder of formalist modern abstraction. The word swan in Motherwell's title refers to Mallarmé's famous sonnet of 1885, known informally as his Swan, that begins with the line, the virginal, vibrant, and beautiful dawn. The sonnet literalizes its figurative references, swans, which are in French, cygne, C-Y-G-N-E, a homonym for S-I-G-N-E, meaning sign, which underscores the poem's black type printed on white paper with generous margins. The first, lowercase swan in the poem, indicates the creature's earthly attachment. It is buried beneath a glacier, a figurative reference to the white paper on which the poem is presented, making it both a metaphor and a literalization of the white support for the printed poem itself. The second swan, its allegorical counterpart, is distinguished at the end of the poem by a capital S in English, or C in French, cygne, and thereby implying a connection with the constellation Cygnus. Mallarmé's two swans point to the poem's way of functioning as a double sign, both self-reflexively and literally, by pointing to itself as a printed object as well as symbolizing its role in catalyzing transcendent experience. In this and other poems, Mallarmé helps to initiate and substantiate a tradition of formalist modern abstraction. Through the contrapuntal shifts between materialistic and figurative meanings, he creates a shift he often employs to connote poetry's frustrated aspirations to achieve ideal moments while being weighted down by its self-reflexive and material form. I believe an understanding of the role materials play in art's meaning is one reason why so many important artists like Degas, Gauguin, Manet, Monet, Renoir, Rodin, Whistler, and others, including some well-known musicians and poets, attended Mallarmé's Tuesday evenings. As he told Degas when the painter was trying to write sonnets, quote, "Poems, Degas, are made with words, not ideas," end of quote. In the subsequent collages that Motherwell continued to create throughout his life, the velocities were less frenetic, even though he maintained the view that feelings are based on interactions of very concrete elements from the world, such as cigarette and food wrappers, packaging sent to the artist, and printed materials of interest. Motherwell's generous incorporation of ephemera from his personal world is based on an assumption, similar to Jean-Paul Sartre, that whatever pertains to him is of universal human interest and will prove intriguing and meaningful for his viewers. While Motherwell's paintings achieve wall-sized proportions, his collages remain intimate until the 1970s, and their scale was determined by the very personal ephemera he incorporates in them. Lee Krasner. As a preamble to my discussion of Krasner's collages, please note my past work on her art. Differing from Motherwell's belief in the catalyzing power of the materials with which he is working, Krasner's collages focus on dialogues with herself and others. She first takes up this medium after Pollock's return to drinking. Several years after the completion of her remarkable Little Image series, Krasner embraced the interpersonal psychology of the American neo-Freudian Harry Stack Sullivan, who subscribed to pragmatism's view of the mind as a social creation. Sullivan underplayed the concept of a core self and instead considered personality in terms of complex interpersonal relationships, many stemming from childhood. In the mid-1950s, Krasner sought the counsel of Solvanian therapist Dr. Leonard Siegel. At the time, Sullivan's ideas were being accepted among a number of her contemporaries, so Krasner would have had many opportunities to familiarize herself with this approach. Her knowledge of the Solvanian interactive system can also be documented by Pollock's decision in 1951 to work with the Solvanian therapist Dr. Ralph Klein. Pollock later consulted with Krasner's analyst regarding problems with their marriage, thus indicating both artists' awareness of the significance Solvanians attribute to interactive patterns. Viewing herself and her art in terms of ongoing social dynamics freed Krasner from the pressure of creating and adhering to the one-image styles, we might call it branding, undertaken by some abstract expressionists. Rather than succumbing to this reductive form of self-definition, Krasner chose the diametrically opposite position of an interactive art that carries on a conversation at times with Pollock's paintings and drawings, and at other times with the art of such abstract expressionists as Motherwell. Sullivanians reject the tradition of an essentialized self and also dismiss theories of self-expression predicated on the unfolding of an inner essence throughout life. They view self-exploration and self-expression as complex processes involving both internal and external conversations among the various interpersonal roles that have been naturalized as the self. Krasner's embrace of Sullivan's interpersonal psychology can be correlated with the rhetorical trope metonymy. This is a view I first addressed in my essay for the catalog Women of Abstract Expressionism. Philosophers have traditionally regarded metonymy as a poetic device for condensing and classifying established, contingent, tangential, and contextual relationships in terms of associations, making metonyms more relevant for realistic prose and representational art, that is, for immersion in the world. Greek philosophers, however, downgraded metonymy by personifying it as the lackluster stepsister of metaphor. It's assumed to be more mature, original, intelligent, and proactive poetic male counterpart. These Greek philosophers base their view on metaphor's ability to move terms from one semantic field to another, as in the expression, "her eyes were fireflies," thereby enacting stirring and often innovative shifts in thought. In 1982, feminist psychologist Carol Gilligan made positive connections between traditional metonymical characteristics and females' orientation to the world. She postulates, quote, "the psychology of women that has consistently been described as distinctive in its great orientation toward relationships and interdependence implies a more contextual mode of judgment, that is metonymy, and a different moral understanding," end quote. Gilligan believes an ethics with, quote, "insistent contextual relativism might appear to be inclusive and diffuse in the male perspective," end of quote. Literary theorist Jill Mattis reinforces this metonymical reading in terms of the need for, quote, "a new language in psychology to deal with a different sense of the female self, one that emphasizes affiliations, maintenance of connections and relationships, thereby stressing context, relativism, and connection links," end of quote. While these thoughtful analyses of metonymy aim to establish universal and gendered differences, I do not regard metonymy as the sole prerogative of women throughout history. Instead, in my analysis of Krasner's work, I consider metonymy as an adjunct to Sullivanian therapy. Krasner departs from many other abstract expressionists in believing that her feelings are always mediated, always subject to the interpersonal patterns forming her nature. In her art, and primarily in her paintings, she came to regard her feelings as topics of discussion and even censorship by a partially disembodied consciousness represented by the staring eyes that began appearing in her works in the 1950s, which might parallel the observation of her favorite poet, Arthur Rimbaud, who wrote of his inner self as the there where I is another. Among first-generation members of the New York School, Krasner should be considered its preeminent existentialist because her sense of self in her work remains so open. Of course, the tearing and cutting both she and Motherwell relied upon when creating some of their collages bespeaks a certain existential power. Krasner disclaimed affinities with one image art, quote, "I've never understood the fixed image. I've never experienced this state of being where you fix an image and this becomes your identification. It's rigid. Its purity is alarming, so to speak. It terrifies me, in a sense," quotes closed. To make sure her point was clearly understood, she added, "It's rigid as against being alive." Beginning in 1953, Krasner found a way to deal with her frustrations about her art, in addition to the challenges of living with an alcoholic, through alternate destructive and reconstructive acts in which she ripped or cut apart either her own or Pollock's works and then recombined them into such collages as Black and White. She has recalled the intensity of her first self-destructive act, that was followed by sessions of reclamation and recreation. Quote, it started in 1953. I had the studio hung solidly with drawings, floor to ceiling, all around. Walked in one day, hated it all, took it down, tore everything, and threw it on the floor. And when I came back, it was a couple of weeks before I opened the door again. It was seemingly a very destructive act. I don't know why I did it, except I certainly did it. When I opened the door and walked in, the floor was solidly covered with these torn drawings that I had left, and they began to interest me, and I started collaging. Well, it started with drawings. Then I took my canvases and cut and began doing the same thing, and that ended in my collage show in 1955, quotes close. Held at Eleanor Ward's Stable Gallery. May we go back up? Thank you, Helen. Held at Eleanor Ward's Stable Gallery, this collage exhibition was later referred to by the preeminent abstract expressionist critic Clement Greenberg as one of the most important exhibitions of the decade. Greenberg's assessment, in my opinion, was one of the main causes of Motherwell's lasting enmity toward Krasner. In the 1990s, when Motherwell realized that I was researching Krasner's art, he said, "Of course you know I detest the woman." Part of Motherwell's long-term ire about Krasner may have resulted from the fact that in 1955, she created some of the first large-scale collages. One of the biggest, Shooting Gold, is almost 7 by 5 feet. Others were around 6 feet in height, much bigger than Motherwell's Joy of Living and Mallarmé's Swan, which are both 43.5 inches in height. As I noted earlier, Motherwell did not begin making monumental collages until the 1970s, almost 2 decades after Krasner. I should also point out that Krasner took a dim view of Motherwell and his work, even though she had carried on an artistic conversation with his elegies in the mid-1950s. In 1956, slightly before Pollock's death with her painting Prophecy, and soon after his fatal accident with her magisterial Earth Green series, followed several years later by the Umber paintings or Umber series, Krasner began once again painting with great intensity, creating some of her most important canvases. Although she did not return to collage until the later 1970s, a case can be made for viewing such paintings as Majuscule and Rising Green in terms of a collage aesthetic, since shapes in these pieces look as if they have been cut with scissors. In 1976, her series 11 Ways to Use the Words to See surprised and delighted some members of the art world when it was shown at Pace Gallery in New York City. In this series, Krasner embarked on the new idea of dramatizing confrontations between modernism and incipient postmodernism through works titled after various verb tenses. Their historical significance largely resides in their departure from Greenberg's 1960s insistence on the presentness of modernist art in favor of a delayed and extended mode of viewing. The year before Krasner initiated this series, exhibitions of her early drawings were shown in Washington, D.C. and in New York City. They were inspired by the discovery of a cache of her Hans Hofmann School charcoal drawings created during the years 1937 through 40 that had been stored in a barn on Springs property and were soon forgotten. Some of these drawings had smudged over time and had left mirror impressions on the cover sheets protecting them. The 35 to 40-year-old drawings were mostly studies of studio models in which Krasner had carefully adhered to Hoffman's teachings by making the overall dimensions of the paper a key compositional determinant. After these 2 shows of her early drawings, Krasner decided to rework some of her early pieces. Of these early pieces, including the mirror impressions of them, to create monumental collages. She exaggerated differences between the old drawings and the new structures under which they were now subsumed. Krasner recalled, quote, "At first, I did have some nostalgia about the drawings, but then I began to look at them as if they weren't done by me, simply pieces of material for making new work," end of quote. Krasner turned her early works as studio models into decorative patterns by cutting up and rearranging them without considering their original function. In doing so, she dispenses with Hoffman's modern art grammar as she raises the question of artistic language to a new level in which her teacher's modernism becomes the object, but not the subject of her new artworks. The series, Ongoing Dialectic Between Past and Present, enables Krasner to debunk the theory that artists must create works with a unary focus. In these collages, she carries on a conversation with her past self about the continued relevance of modernism, its ghostly impressions, and aftermath. The artist quotes herself only to undermine herself and thus to open her art into a quandary of new possibilities. The internal dialectic between this artist's selves that have changed over time is also evident in Crisis Moment, in which she cut up lithographs from her pink stone edition to create a collage painting. For To the North, lithographs from the blue stone edition were employed. A similar deflection of present and past time can be seen in the postmodern Between Two Appearances, in which she creates and also quotes passages of her own work in this piece. Tough, yet kind, shrewd, sometimes guileless, loaded with common sense, comfortable in her own body, and known among her friends for her quick, piercing wit and love of gossip, Krasner was far more demanding of herself than others. Her intransigence, together with her relentless pursuit of an ever-evasive self, constitutes her special contribution to abstract expressionism. Her collages evidence her interest in inter- and intra-personal conversations. Collage for Krasner is not just an artistic medium. It constitutes an ongoing dialogue capable of defining the self. Awe-inspiring in terms of its mellifluous prose and range of theoretical and artistic references, Motherwell was physically awkward and yet surprisingly elegant. During his life, he remained perpetually open to new ideas, even though he steadfastly adhered to the concepts he first embraced in his 20s, such as Whitehead's philosophy and Mallarmé's poetry, making Motherwell an intriguing conundrum. Differing substantially from Krasner's collages, Motherwell's bespeak his strong interest in philosophy and his enduring commitment to art's materiality. Feeling for Motherwell was structural and relational, even though it might incorporate passages created by spontaneous outbursts. As he noted in 1946, quote, "It is natural to rearrange or invent in order to bring about states of feeling that we like, just as a new tenant refurnishes a house." 4 years later, he differentiated feelings from emotions when he wrote, quote, "Emotion is not determined by what is immediately surrounding one, but is something already in one, something that one carries around with oneself." Motherwell's artistically inscribed feelings are thus predicated on relationships between his selected components, not the artist's emotions, which have customarily been assumed to be one of the mainstays of expressionistic art. Excuse me. In conclusion, I would like to focus again on Krasner by pointing out that feelings in her collages depend on ongoing conversations with herself and others that are readily evident in the dynamic tensions and relationships comprising her art. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Robert. That is a wonderful comparison and differentiation among two of what I would assume we all think of as the premier collagists of the 20th century, and Americans, I should say, not to throw Kurt Schwitters under the bus. But I'd like to check here and see if we have any questions. Nothing in the chat, but I have to unshare my screen in order to see everyone. And if you have a question or comment, please feel free to unmute yourself. Ellen, go ahead.
Okay. You will be delighted, as was I, to find that in the additions to the Krasner catalog raisonné, there are many more examples that fit into the category of the use of collage, the use of her prints, like especially Redstone, Bluestone, whatever it is. Celestial Equator, Culminating Point, December 22nd. There are a number of new variations of those that also include some of them, a great many of them, that also include collaged materials, so that will change, expand, whatever, our thoughts about the end of her career, because that's like 1979, 80.
Oh,
Okay.
nice. Now,
So,
are some of these in your new publication, Ellen?
I'm sorry?
Some of these in your new publication?
Well, they will be. I mean, I'm working on this. It will primarily actually be digital. So yeah. So I spent several days in New York. One of them was the day of the Armageddon sky from Canada, looking through all of these and trying to figure out which of the existing works these are riffs off of. Okay, because there are quite a few. There are quite a few of them. So also, I have a question for you. Did you see that thing in the New Yorker about the Sullivan business being a cult?
I heard.
And what did you think about it?
Told me about it
Yeah.
last week, and
Yeah.
I know it did become a cult. I gave a talk on Krasner years ago at the studio school, and it was very interesting because a number of people came out of the woodwork who had known Krasner and Pollock in the early 50s, and they were still committed Sylvanians. And I think there were times when Sullivan was very, very important. And then, as happens with many orthodoxies, over time, they begin to change and twist and become something else.
Well, because they were basically saying that the fact that he had gone to a Sullivanian therapist is what killed him and ruined his marriage. In other words, because he was encouraged to forget about monogamy and et cetera, et cetera. But I don't know.
Yeah.
I haven't actually read the book. I only read the article about the book.
Now we've all got to read the book, but I have several questions about it at the Pollock House. And the previous exhibition before this Portrait in Green show was called Creative Exchanges, and it was about the people who were listed in Jackson and Lee's address book, one of whom was Leonard Segal. Was her Sullivanian therapist, and we had a painting. It was a reproduction of a painting that they supposedly did together in 1956, where there's a big splash. It's on a black background. There's a big splash of white, and then there are calligraphic markings on two sides of it. We don't know who it's according to Celia Segal, who was Segal's daughter. They did the painting together, but we don't know who did which part of it, or whether it was done before Jackson died or after. So it's a bit of a puzzle. I have not been able to get back in touch with Celia Segal. She had sent me the photograph of the painting in 2008. We tried to reach her to get the original for the show, but we couldn't, so we used a reproduction of it. But it's quite intriguing to think of her being almost encouraged to express her feelings or emotions, or whichever way you want to describe it, in therapy through her art, which Pollock never did. His paintings or his drawings that he took to his therapist were not done as part of a therapy session. but this painting evidently was.
Cool.
Helen,
Yeah.
Helen,
And I'm hearing Teresa, is that?
yeah,
Yes. Okay.
that's me. I wanted just to say what the title was. You didn't say it. It's White Clean.
White clean.
That leaves us all wondering, you
Mhm.
know, was this after he died
Or before.
knows?
Mm.
or before?
Okay, do we have any other questions or comments? Please feel free to unmute yourselves. I have a comment. I'm interested in this difference between feeling and emotion, because when you think of abstract expressionism, as you pointed out, the idea of, as Pollock put it, expressing my feelings rather than illustrating them was something that he was trying to achieve. But to what extent are feelings very personal rather than emotions, which might be more generalized, that other people would relate to?
Well, I think the whole problem of bridging the synapse between the artist and the work of art is something that Motherwell sort of was a bit wary of. And he felt that he often used the terms felt quality, the felt quality of existence, the felt quality of something else. And I wondered, because I lived at his guest house for a year after I wrote my dissertation. I was teaching at Yale at the time, and I got to know Motherwell really well. And I thought, what is this with feelings? And when I went through Whitehead, I realized that feelings for Whitehead are something that is structured and relational. And so for Motherwell, he felt that he could embody in the work of art feelings, and that is separate from his own emotion. And that, you know, people used to think, oh, well, if an artist has a feeling, that feeling is going to be immediately reflected on canvas or in a drawing. Well, for Motherwell, it's like, no, it doesn't work that way at all. And I think that's one reason Whitehead was so very important to him. And he kept citing Whitehead throughout his life. So I went through the various books of writings of Motherwell's and other things, and it was quite fascinating to see how often he would go back and rely on Whitehead yet again, and Whitehead's ideas of feelings. Motherwell, I think, did not trust his emotions. He was psychoanalyzed for years. And I think he felt that emotions can come and go, but he wanted something that was much more stable and much more lasting in work. So he felt that it was actually the feelings were embodied in the work itself.
So it would be the opposite, that feelings would be more universal or more accessible, rather than emotions, which might be fleeting or somehow not so translatable into the art. I would have thought it was the other way around, but I mean, I take Motherwell's word for it if that's what he was aiming for.
Well, that's what he was aiming for. I think the idea of saying that they're universal, I think he would say, no, they're embodied in the work of art. They're historically generated, so, we don't all look at works and feel the same way, but there is the possibility of seeing these relationships. Mm-hmm. And that was all important for him.
Mm-hmm. So he was well aware that the viewer was going to bring his or her own interpretation to it, that he wasn't trying to impose something.
And their own emotions to it. So, there are so many ways of looking at things, but he wanted to be sure that the work somehow could stand alone, even separate from him. Mm-hmm. And, there's that very famous statement by Motherwell where he talks about how he starts off and there are layers of willing, and he has to break loose from the willing in order to let the work come forth. And I think this idea of materiality, for Motherwell, he always said it was the big difference between surrealism and abstract expressionism, because for the abstract expressionists, materials and the role of the material in the creative process was much more important. What I did in my book on Motherwell is I started looking at psychic automatism, the surrealist technique, which Motherwell tried to rename plastic automatism. And he saw it as a three-part project of sort of dripping and free association, and then looking at those for structures and then finishing it in a certain way, according to a number of different styles, according to the artist. And I realized that the way he was breaking down psychic automatism or plastic automatism was very Whiteheadian.
Mhm. Well, also, when you talk about materials and the importance of the material as a generative force in itself, there you really come up with Krasner, because especially that whole passage about her tearing up her drawings and throwing and being disgusted with them, and then suddenly looking at them and seeing potential in them, that stimulus coming directly from this destructive act, but coming out of the material that she destroyed. And she talks about it too in her painting process, that working on a blank canvas and maybe an obsession with a color will start her off, and then she makes some brush strokes on the canvas, something will suggest itself, and so that it's a kind of a self-generating process that depends in part on the materials giving you that forward momentum.
I think with both of them, there were intrinsic and extrinsic aspects. For Motherwell, it was these personal ephemera. And then the work of art becomes a sort of being in its own. I think for Krasner, there was always this sense of, and I really think it was Sylvanian in terms of connections, either with her past selves, with certain patterns, with other people. And so art becomes much more of a conversation. Whereas with Motherwell, it's a conversation internally, and I think almost always internally among part to part.
Okay, are there any other comments? Well, I'm so grateful to you for wrapping up our three-part symposium on Lee, whose work is now on view at the Paula Krasner House through the end of October. This has been a really stimulating series, and thank you so much, Robert. Thank you everyone for attending, and hope you'll all be able to see the exhibition.
May I interject just a moment? I think we should recognize Joan Martyr, who is, Joan, would you raise your hand, please? Because Joan Martyr, like Ellen Landau, both have been just amazing scholars, and I understand they have a book out this year together, and they continue to work on abstract expressionism and women. Ellen Landau, as you may have gathered, did the marvelous catalog raisonné that all of us have benefited from, and I have personally enjoyed working with both of them over the years. And I put up The Women of Abstract Expressionism, which was a book that Joan edited, and it was so wonderful to be asked to participate in that exhibition. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you all, and I hope to see you soon at the Paula Krasner House. Good evening.